Greetings to all Formula One fans and motorsport enthusiasts in general. The semi-automatic gearbox or paddle shift transmission is one of the most significant technological achievements in Formula One history. Within a few years after Ferrari presented the ballistics of this technology in 1989, all teams copied it for themselves. This system, without which it's now difficult to imagine racing cars and even some road vehicles. But the car on which this revolutionary system was installed was almost cancelled due to internal struggles at Ferrari. Let's figure out how Ferrari almost deprived us of paddle shift transmission and once again proved to be clowns. This semi-automatic gearbox was developed by legendary engineer John Barnard, who had already gained fame in American championships and Formula One. At the end of 1986, Barnard moved from McLaren, where during his years of work, drivers became world champions 3 times, and in one of these seasons, Niki Lauda became champion, beating his teammate Alain Prost by half a point, which speaks to the incredible dominance of that car. Ferrari, who hadn't won since 1985, and at the beginning of '87, Barnard began work on his first project for the Italian team, which ultimately led to the creation of the iconic Ferrari 640 of 1989. Racing constructors always try to make their car lighter, more compact, and most importantly, aerodynamically more efficient, and John Barnard in particular understood this and paid increased attention to it. He gained ground effect experience back in America building cars for IndyCar, where he also used a solid monocoque from durable alloys that included the engine as a load-bearing part of the car's structure, thereby reducing the size and weight of the chassis itself, which allows more room for aerodynamics. In Barnard's opinion, the chassis should be no larger than the driver's rear. Thanks to the narrow chassis, he built a car with the largest tunnels for ground effect. McLaren gave him money for any needs to implement his ideas, and he spent more time working with aerospace companies than motorsport ones. In 1981, Barnard was the one who built the first Formula One car using a solid carbon monocoque, making the car more compact and lighter while increasing strength. And that same year, the strength of this monocoque saved their team's driver at Monza. With a normal structure, the consequences of that accident without such a monocoque could have been fatal for John Watson. And in 1983, Barnard was the first to use side pods in the form of a bottleneck, using tight packaging of elements and narrowing the pods at the rear, allowing more air to flow through the car's shape and pass to its central rear part and create less drag, as well as increase the efficiency of the rear wing and diffuser by extracting air from there at the end of the car. No matter how the regulations changed, to this day, this design remains an indispensable standard in Formula One. And as F1 approached the end of its turbo era, Barnard, realizing the importance of creating more compact cars, faced a problem. The gear shift mechanism, the bulky H-pattern gearbox, was a headache for all engineers. Not only did the gear lever take up space on the right side of the driver, thereby preventing a narrow cockpit, but the entire gear shift mechanism dictated the car's architecture all the way to the rear. Barnard himself said, "I was fed up with finding how to fit all this in the car and decided to think about how I could get around this problem. If I could hydraulically shift gears and control this with a button, then all I would need is just to run wiring to the gearbox and then the problem would be solved." And ultimately, Barnard presented an alternative solution. Initially, he planned to place 2 buttons on the steering wheel, which is quite convenient, which the driver would press to upshift or downshift, which would send an electronic signal to the hydraulic actuator in the gearbox, which would change the gear. But ultimately, he abandoned buttons and switched to the paddles familiar to us. The advantages of the system were obvious. The driver could always hold the steering wheel with both hands, and drivers' hands would no longer be rubbed bloody, as often happened in Monaco from the large number of gear changes. According to Barnard, he was looking for a way to get rid of the gearbox lever since 1980 when he worked on IndyCar machines. This also became the beginning of sequential gearboxes, that is, sequential gear shifting. The driver could no longer damage the engine by shifting to the wrong gear, and the electronics itself no longer allowed downshifting if the revs were too high. Ferrari had already tried a sequential gearbox almost a decade earlier on Gilles Villeneuve's car. But the electronics of those times didn't provide the necessary efficiency, and this system was abandoned immediately after testing. But why did Ferrari start work on the 1989 car in early '87? Barnard came to the team too late to work on the '87 car. He could no longer make his changes there. And actually, Barnard's initial project is the non-racing Ferrari 639, which was originally supposed to compete in '88. This was the last year when turbo engines were allowed. But Ferrari intended to switch to a naturally aspirated V12 a year earlier than necessary. Partly to get ahead in development, and also because of concerns about how much the turbo engine would be choked by FIA restrictions on fuel volume in '88. But when the '88 season started, Ferrari stated that the car was not ready. There wasn't enough time needed to develop the gearbox, and because of difficulties in communication with Barnard, who worked in Great Britain. And Barnard in turn blamed the engine development department for the V12 not being ready on time. As a result, Ferrari spent the last year of the turbo era on an adapted version of last year's car, which represented nothing against the dominant McLaren Honda. However, Barnard really couldn't get access to Ferrari's wind tunnel to test the concept he was working on, and eventually the reason for this became clear. From Maranello to Barnard's British division, rumors leaked that time in the wind tunnel was occupied by another project led by Harvey Postlethwaite and Jean-Claude Migeot, and it was assumed that the model they were working on had a raised nose. I have a separate video about the car's nose. The secret project was kept secret from Enzo Ferrari, although his son Piero was in the know, as was racer Michele Alboreto, who didn't get along with Barnard. Internal politics was nothing new for Ferrari, but even by those standards, this was an incredible level of intrigue. Enzo Ferrari personally hired Barnard, so it was a huge risk to work in the shadows against the man Enzo himself chose to bring Ferrari back to the top. Enzo chose Barnard precisely for the reason that he began to realize that championships could no longer be won by focusing only on the engine. In those times, British teams and specialists were far ahead in aerodynamics and achieved their success mainly through chassis and wind tunnels. And Barnard was the ideal candidate to change the Italian situation. In McLaren times, team management fully supported Barnard, working on the system of tell us how much money you need and we'll give it to you. But here, Enzo was ready to go much further. A sign of how interested Enzo was in Barnard was that he agreed to the British designer's desire to create a technical office in England rather than work at Maranello, which created conditions for the secret project to appear. If Barnard had worked in Italy as his colleagues advised him to better control what was happening at Ferrari, then most likely this wouldn't have happened at all. But Barnard insisted on working from Britain to be less distracted by the Ferrari factory and the Italian press, which would follow their every step and failure. He also banned wine during lunch break for workers, which was a long-standing Ferrari tradition. And the secret car was planned for the '88 season, just like Barnard's car. And unlike the British development, this car was built around a turbo engine. So it turned out that for '88, Ferrari was developing a car with a turbo engine and one with a naturally aspirated V12. If you think that clowning happens at Ferrari only now, then it was even worse back then. Nothing speaks better about how self-destructive Ferrari's politics were in that era than the fact that neither of these cars was ready for the season on time. This was uncharacteristic for Barnard's character, but he took no action when he learned about the secret project. Instead, he waited until his concept was tested for the first time in May '88 and was met with approval from the increasingly weak Enzo Ferrari. Only after that did Barnard meet with Ferrari managing director Gianni Rosselli. As soon as Rosselli learned about this, he immediately went to Enzo Ferrari, who immediately took action against the conspirators. As a result, Piero Ferrari was pushed to the background and Postlethwaite, Migeot, and Alboreto left for Tyrrell. But ahead of Ferrari and Barnard were even more problems following the death of Enzo Ferrari in August of the same year. A power struggle broke out at Ferrari, with Fiat executives fighting for positions, and another secret car project was launched. This time, the idea was simpler. An improved version of the 639 that didn't make it to racing, which Barnard built, but with a classic gearbox, as Fiat didn't believe in Barnard's concept. After long disputes, management even forced Barnard to agree to a new contract clause according to which, in case of paddle shift failure, Ferrari could switch to normal shifting and get rid of Barnard while not offering him any severance package. This idea was quickly excluded when team manager Mansell tested the backup car that was made at Fiat's order and immediately refused it in favor of Barnard's paddle shifters. The successor to the non-racing 639, Model 640 of '89 turned out fast and beautiful. It would seem, well, here's Ferrari's renaissance. But at preseason tests, it turned out absolutely unreliable. Partly because of the new gearbox. The gearbox itself was sufficient and was located in the standard way, but had a hydraulic drive with power supply which had problems. The batteries were not powerful enough for this task, and Ferrari management couldn't do anything about it since Barnard himself designed this chassis. Not trusting the Italians, and built it in such a way that installing a standard gearbox on it was already impossible. Nigel Mansell even booked his flight home before the first race of the year in Brazil, realizing how unreliable this car was. But not so fast. He won that race, and then joked about it for a long time. However, throughout the season, the car was extremely unreliable. Mansell finished only 6 races out of 15, and his teammate Gerhard Berger reached the finish line only 3 times. The fact that they solved the battery problems by France helped the team take 3rd place in the championship with 9 podiums for the season. Mansell, even before the start of the season, talked about the huge potential of this car, and so it turned out. All the times Ferrari finished, they were always on the podium and held victory 3 times. That same year, a Ferrari driver got into a serious accident with a full fuel tank, resulting in burns to his hands. And while receiving treatment from physiotherapist Niki Lauda, it was expected that he would miss many stages, but he only missed 1. Also, paddle shift transmission didn't require such effort as on a standard gearbox. But what was the fate of the secret car? It is widely known that the Tyrrell design that Postlethwaite and Mijo developed in '89 was based on ideas they worked on at Ferrari. And a year later, they first applied the high nose concept, which, like paddle shift transmission, was quickly adopted by all teams. Observers at Maranello noticed the high nose on Ferrari's secret project several years earlier. And although Mijo claims that the concept was developed when he and Postlethwaite were at Tyrrell, Barnard believes that these ideas that the pair used at Tyrrell were from the secret project. John Barnard thought the secret car was a good attempt, saying it was a good attempt to prove they don't need me. I was competing with McLaren, but Ferrari, damn it, I worked for them. His complaint was not that the team was working on other ideas, but that the team was working directly against him. Barnard was impressed by the high nose and what advantages it gave by directing the speed flow under the car. But he was not entirely impressed with how Tyrrell implemented it. The angular section connecting the front wing to the raised nose left space under it. Continuing Ferrari politics and pressure from the Italian press got the better of Barnard, and at the end of 1989 he moved to Benetton, where he had to raise the team practically from scratch. When it came time to design the '91 car, Barnard realized it made sense to borrow high-nose ideas, but he came up with a better way to do it. He didn't like Tyrrell's implementation, which he compared to long whiskers, so he came up with a variant in which the front wing was continuous along the entire length, and supports descended down from the nose to attach it to the wing. For Barnard, this was a very personal topic, so he said that based on wind tunnel tests, his wing concept was better than Tyrrell's concept, precisely due to such implementation of the wing plane. In the end, it was Barnard's interpretation of the high nose that was copied by everyone else and not Tyrrell's, which confirms his words, and he again avenged them for Ferrari's secret project. Such an interesting episode in the life of a truly legendary Formula One engineer who influenced the entire automotive industry in the world with his innovations. Without carbon monocoque, it's hard to imagine any racing car, and these steering wheel paddles can now be seen even on city cars, not to mention that all fast cars use them. The raised nose and side pods in bottleneck form became standard in almost all open-wheel series. This is the man who directly contributed to Lauda and Prost's championships and left his developments for Schumacher's championships at Benetton and Ferrari, and could have contributed to Senna's championship, but John was too honest. When Ayrton invited him to dinner in '90 at Monaco, Senna asked, "Should I move to your Benetton next year?" Barnard answered that of course he would like to have such a driver, but at the moment the team is not good enough for Senna. Had Barnard not been so honest, who knows how the fate of Senna or Benetton would have turned? Barnard deserves a separate story in the future. This man who didn't just develop interesting solutions but also proved their effectiveness, making them an absolute standard for all motorsport as if it was always here. I highly recommend listening to the podcast with Barnard on the Formula One channel, where he talked precisely about this period of his career and even more clowning at Ferrari and about the pilots he worked with. It was especially interesting to hear about Schumacher, how his style contradicted the style of all other pilots and Barnard's idea of a fast car. And Ferrari almost deprived us of one of these developments. Well, Ferrari is always Ferrari, so Binotto keeps the team's traditions and you shouldn't blame him personally too much. Write in the comments what topics would be interesting to you, especially technical ones, since the end of the season is approaching and there won't be particularly interesting innovations. We'll delve more into topics from the past. If you liked the video, I remind you to like and subscribe so you don't miss interesting videos.